Hello everyone, welcome to episode 3. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about Murakami Haruki. This, I'm still trying to figure out. I don't know how to work it. I don't know if it's gonna work. It's okay, I'm gonna wing it, just like I'm winging everything so far. We start with the early life. So, Murakami Haruki was born in Kyoto, Japan in 1949. Both his parents were Japanese literature teachers, and his grandfather was a Buddhist priest. Now, I think to understand Murakami in many ways and to understand some parts of his personal life story, it's important to understand or to learn a little bit about life in Kyoto. First, I want to tell you that in World War II, in early 1945, Kyoto was on the list of potential targets for the atomic bomb, alongside Kokura, a city in Fukuoka, and Hiroshima, of course. However, the US secretary at the time, his name was Henry L. Stimson, he was the one who insisted that Kyoto should be removed from the list. He argued that not only is it strategically important, Kyoto is also a city of immense cultural, religious, and historical significance. So he was concerned that destroying such a place will create such deep bitterness that the post-war reconciliation would be close to impossible. Now, there are rumors that his decision was also related to the fact that he had his honeymoon in Kyoto, so it had a personal, significance to him. But they say it's just a rumor. However, it is true that Henry L. Stimson was the one who argued against having Kyoto on the list. He didn't want to have the city destroyed because it's proved in his journals, actually. It's written in his journals. So as a result, many of the temples, the shrines, the historical buildings survived the war. And that helped Kyoto become a World Heritage Site. And in case you didn't know that, Kyoto was actually the capital of Japan for 1,100 years. Now, I also think it's important for you to understand the personality of Kyoto residents. People from Kyoto are described as very refined. They are very soft-spoken and graceful. And they are also known for being indirect communicators. For example, instead of, let's say, expressing refusal in a very blunt manner, they express it in a very indirect way. For example, let's say someone asked me to do something for them. So instead of saying, no, I can't, I don't want to, I would say, that would be difficult. So they would try to say things as indirectly and as gently as possible. People from Tokyo are also known to be very tradition conscious. Tokyo culture is very known for being respectful of culture and the traditions. For example, that includes the classical art, the tea ceremony, the kimono culture, the traditional clothing, and the seasonal customs. They're also very reserved, very sophisticated. The classical culture and etiquette is very important there. Now, to get a bigger picture, I will compare people from Kyoto to people from Tokyo, let's say. In Tokyo, life is very busy, very fast-paced. Every person is just focused on themselves. Literally, if you live in Tokyo, no one looks at you, no one crosses eyes while walking on the street. Everyone is just, people are very career-focused. You could say they are more individualistic than other regions in Japan. But of course, what they have in common with, let's say, people from Kyoto is that they're very polite and also very reserved. Now, to give you yet a bigger picture, I will compare Kyoto and Tokyo to people from Osaka, let's say. People in Osaka are known to be very outspoken, very loud, very friendly. They have a sense of humor. They are less formal, and you can definitely say they are more direct in the way they express themselves. Okay, so now we have a clear picture of in what environment Murakami was brought up. Now, growing up, Murakami read a lot of books, but mostly Western literature. He was very much into Russian literature. He would read a lot of books by Dostoevsky, for example. He also enjoyed a lot of American literature, even European, French books. He loved reading. For him, reading was, of course, just like a lot of people, a way to escape the real world. You would think that Murakami studied literature, but he didn't. He actually studied drama in the University of Waseda. After graduating, he opened the bar with his wife Yoko, and together they lived a life alone. They decided not to have children. So it was just both of them living a quiet life. Now, in 1978, Murakami was at a baseball game, and he says that he had an epiphany, or a divine message came to him, and it told him that he was to become a writer. So he started writing, and a year later, he published his first book. He was 30. His first book was entitled Hear the Wind Sing. And from then on, Murakami started writing more and more and publishing more books. He started getting gradually famous. And that kind of made him uncomfortable. What you need to understand is that Murakami's writing style was very different from other Japanese writers' writing style. And to tell you the truth, in the early days, he was considered as a black sheep in the, literary scene. So he always felt like he didn't fit well in Japan. His writing style was very far from, group culture. It was more individualized. You can also see how his characters are very influenced by the West. They always read foreign books, they listen to foreign music. So you could say this need to escape is also apparent in his books through his characters, even through the settings. For example, you have mentions of faraway mountains or, isolated locations like a cabin in the woods. In a way, Murakami wanted to run away from the socio-cultural constraints of being Japanese. He wanted to leave this highly group-oriented society, and he wanted to discover what it's like to be an individual. He didn't feel like he fit the cultural norms. He also felt a lot of resistance from the Japanese critics. So overall, he felt like the environment he was living in was too stifling. He wanted to set himself free. And so he decided to leave. He left for Europe with his wife. Now, beyond that desire of finding a space where he can find creative freedom far away from the social constraints, he also was very curious to, discover different cultures, different environments, learning new languages. He wanted to broaden his perspective, in a way. So he left Japan in 1986 with his wife. First, he lived in Italy and Greece, and then they moved to the United States. Murakami taught in universities like Princeton, very prestigious universities. There he would write, he would teach, and he would, engage with different literary communities. Okay, now I'm gonna tell you about Murakami novels that I've read so far, very briefly. The first Murakami novel I've read is After Dark. It was published in 2004. And it was actually a book that my friend introduced me to. She gave me her copy to read. After Dark can be described as a very quiet, atmospheric novel that is set in Tokyo. The story happens over the course of one night. The story follows several disconnected, yet oddly, in some weird way, connected characters. The novel opens in a diner scene with a character who's the main focus of the novel. Her name is Mari Asai. She's a 19-year-old girl. She's sitting in a diner, she's reading a book, and then she meets an old friend, actually, an old acquaintance, Takahashi. He is a jazz musician. They start talking, and the conversation starts getting deeper and deeper, and she starts reflecting on her own life, her uncertainty about the future, and, deep conversation. At some point, she leaves the diner, and out of nowhere, she finds herself helping a Chinese woman who was brutally beaten in a motel. And just like that, and gradually, Mari Asai is being dragged deeper and deeper into the city's hidden underbelly. Now, running in parallel with Mari's story is her sister's story. Her older sister, Eri, has been in a month-long, mysterious deep sleep. It's not even a coma. They just refer to it as a mysterious deep sleep. Now, in this state of unconsciousness, she drifts into this dreamlike space, and through her sleep, she senses and sees this strange figure watching her from the TV set. I know this all sounds very strange, very random, and you're just starting to get a sense of Murakami's world. I'm not going to say more. I'll just say that this book is heavily based on human connections. we get to witness this very subtle emotional shifts, especially in Mari's personality as, she gets to interact with other characters in the book. So you could say that After Dark is not much of a storyline, but more of a mood. You get to explore this thin line between reality and a dreamlike state. Book 2. Second book I read was Desire, and it was also published in 2004. What attracted me to the book was the title. Now, Desire is not a single novel, but a collection of short stories. And it is obviously centered around the theme of desire, but not the desire that you would think of. It's not just about emotional, love or, physical love. Those stories explore desire through, let's say, physical hunger, like literally, like the need for nourishment, the need for food, longing, romantic infatuation, emotional need, or a yearning for moments that feel fated. The book also shows that sometimes desire drives our life decisions in very unexpected ways. The Strange Library, and it was published in 1983. This book actually was introduced to me by another friend of mine. I borrowed her copy and I read it in one sitting in a cafe. Now, this story follows a young boy who goes to a public library. He was searching for material for a school assignment. And after he asks the librarian for help, the librarian starts taking him deeper and deeper and deeper into the library. They literally start going through this maze-like interior. And then the boy is taken into a room and imprisoned. He meets this very strange character who looks like a sheep. This sheep-like man explains to the boy that he is being held because they want to absorb all his knowledge from him. They want his mind to be effectively read and consumed. And the boy is told that if he tries to escape, he will be killed. Now, while he was trapped, the boy encounters other strange figures. And out of these strange characters, he meets this silent, very sweet girl who appears to be a ghost. We don't know what's real. We don't know what's imagination, and the boy grows more and more anxious as he is awaiting his fate. And that's all I'm gonna say about this story. Another Murakami book that I read is After the Quake, published in the year 2000. It is also a collection of short stories. And all those stories are loosely connected to the emotional, psychological aftermath of the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Even though most of the stories, they do not take place in Kobe itself. But the story explores how a sudden catastrophe, such as this one, it creates an invisible shockwave through the lives of ordinary people. So rather than focusing on the physical destruction of the earthquake, Murakami examines the emotional rupture, the disconnection, the quiet transformation that happens within any life. And you'll notice that Murakami focuses on people whose lives are already fragile. For example, you have spouses who drifted apart. You have people who have drifted apart from their families. You have restless young adults who are still trying to figure their lives out. For example, I specifically remember the story of a guy who was estranged from his family. And when he heard the news about the earthquake that happened in Kobe, he remembered that his father actually lives in Kobe. And even though he hates his father, the earthquake made him think about his father and wonder if his father survived it, even though he was reluctant to try and find out if he actually survived it. So you see how in every story, each character was affected in a different way, depending on what's happening in their lives. Now, I think the most intense Murakami novel I've read was Kafka on the Shore, and it's one of his most famous books. Kafka on the Shore was published in 2002. Now, I say it's an intense read because it was a big novel. It was a big novel and it had a lot to it. And just like After Dark, the book follows two different stories that gradually interweave and interconnect. You have Kafka, the main character. He's a 15-year-old boy. The novel starts with him running away from home. He wants to escape his tyrannical father, and he's also attempting to escape a haunting prophecy that his father gave him. I'm not going to tell you what the prophecy is because it's wild, and if you want to read the book, I would rather you discover it through the book. Now, Kafka, after a long and very strange journey, he seeks refuge in a library. It's actually a private library that is owned by a family. And there he starts searching for an identity or a sense of belonging. And while he's living in this library, he starts experiencing very strange dreams at night where he has very philosophical and emotional conversations with, again, another girl ghost. And of course, he meets other strange characters as well. Now, the other story, the parallel story, it follows an elderly man. His name is Satoru Nakata. Now, after a mysterious childhood trauma, he loses most of his cognitive abilities. However, he gains a power, and this power is an ability to talk to cats. Nakata becomes involved in a series of very strange events. He encounters eccentric and violent figures, and he witnesses very strange phenomena. And that's all I'm going to say about this story. Now, it is said that Kafka on the Shore is actually based on the real-life story of the author Franz Kafka. I used to confuse Kafka and Kafka on the Shore, but then I discovered that Franz Kafka is an author. And apparently this book is based on his real life because apparently he hated his father. Now, on my reading list, I do have a book by Franz Kafka, and I'm very interested in reading it. It's a very short story. It's called Metamorphosis, but we will talk about this later. Now, you may have noticed something recurrent in most of the stories that I just told you about, and that is this existence of supernatural elements. And I think you will find that in most of his books. Now, they usually say that people who are very pragmatic, people who are very logical in the way they think, people who like to know the cause behind something or the mechanism behind how something happens, they will not be able to endure a Murakami book because you will never get an answer of how does that happen or where does that come from or how is that even possible. You think that whatever you're reading is normal, it starts off normal, and then all of a sudden you have a talking cat, or you have characters who mysteriously vanish, and you have characters who have psychic links from a distance with each other. You have shared dream states between characters. You have ghosts. You have characters entering another dimension by, let's say, entering a mysterious forest. Sometimes characters talk with their inner voice as if this inner voice was a separate character with its own name. And I'm going to tell you about my favorite phenomenon in one of his books, actually in Kafka on the Shore. And it's a scene where the sky starts raining fish and leeches all of a sudden. I don't know, there's something about this image that feels very eerie to me. Now, of course, these elements may seem very random and they might seem fun to read about, but of course, everything stems from a deep psychological meaning. And if you read about the analogy behind those details, they turn out to be very fascinating. For example, in Kafka on the Shore, Kafka has this inner voice. In the book, this inner voice is a character called a boy named Crow. They always refer to him as the boy named Crow. So it's Kafka talking with his inner voice. It's his guiding voice. It's a voice that challenges him. It's, in a way, a character that is part challenger and part protector. Kafka is at this very delicate age. He's a teenager, so you feel like this inner voice helps him grow into the person that he's going to become. It helps him confront his fears, his doubts, and growth happens when you learn to deal with your inner voice, your inner demons, your inner darkness. In the book, they also refer to this mysterious forest that Kafka enters. They say that it's supposed to represent the character's subconscious. It's a space where logic and time and identity, everything collapses. It's a space where everything collapses. And this is where Kafka, when he enters the forest, or in other words, his subconscious, he is faced with unresolved trauma and his buried emotions, his worries. Again, it's a way to express how healing happens when you learn to face all these things that you are repressing within you. They also say that the ghost that Kafka encounters on different occasions at night while he's, in an unconscious state, she is supposed to symbolize unresolved grief, being stuck in something that you haven't processed yet. And what was my favorite image when I was reading the book also became my favorite analogy in a way. The scene where the sky starts raining fish and leeches. The way they explain it is when the mind is in turmoil, or when your soul is, in turmoil, the world breaks as well. So when your inner world is destabilized, the outer physical world is also broken. And of course, the prophecy that is mentioned at the beginning of Kafka on the Shore is also very important, and it symbolizes something very important related to the character himself and his psyche. But because I don't want to say anything about the prophecy, I will leave it to you to discover and to analyze if you do read the book. And that's all I'm going to say about Kafka on the Shore. Now we have an idea of some of Murakami's novels, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about his literary genre. Because to be honest with you, when I started reading Murakami, I didn't know how to explain what they made me feel. All I could express was, I love this book. It felt very eerie and very out of this world to me. But at the same time, it's not fantasy. I didn't know where to place it on a shelf. And this is where I discovered a genre called magical realism. Magical realism is a literary style in which magical or supernatural elements, they appear in an ordinary setting. So instead of explaining or questioning the magical elements, the story presents them in a very matter-of-fact way, as if they belong in, normal life. Now, it's important for you to understand the difference between magical realism and fantasy. For example, in fantasy, magic is usually the solution for a problem. It's the way characters find a way out of a problem. But in the case of Murakami's stories, magical elements become just one more thing that complicates the story even further. For example, in a novel like Kafka on the Shore, it's a normal setting, normal characters, but they are faced with endless otherworldly distractions at different points of the story. And these challenges, they don't offer us any answers. They don't even offer the characters any answers. However, it's very enjoyable to see how the human spirit adapts to situations like these, like the resourcefulness of the human spirit. Now, if I were to talk about the themes that Murakami treats in his novels, they are very deep. They are very deep themes, such as love, consciousness, grief, loss, suicide, very important life choices. And one very interesting thing that I read is that Murakami is very interested in cruelty. He's very interested in cruelty because it comes from a dark mind. And he's very fascinated with that. He's very fascinated with the darkness in our minds, and we all have that. And he always says that writers are not any different. So everyone has darkness within them. Now, if I were to describe Murakami's writing style, and it's one of my favorite things about Murakami, is that his writing style is very simple. But you need to know that simple does not mean superficial. The writing can be very simple, very straight to the point, but it can also have a lot of emotional depth. His stories, they have a way of sticking in your head. They stay with you long after you will have finished reading them. I experience that every time. Whenever I finish a book, I feel like I miss it. I miss the world I was in. What I also love about his writing is that he doesn't preach anything. He doesn't shove any ideas, any philosophies, any political statements in your mind. He simply writes what's in his mind. He doesn't even give you any clear answers, any, morals. He makes you question stuff, and you have to come up with your own answers. But the stories are so simple. The writing is so easy. It's so easy to follow. Someone made this analogy that I find very interesting and memorable, is that just like, if you were to ask a Japanese person for guidance, to reach a certain place that you don't know how to get to, they could literally hold your hand and take you there. And this is what Murakami does with his writing. It's literally as if he's guiding you through the book. You are meant to enjoy the reading experience. It's not complicated. It's very easy. It's simple language. Another interesting aspect of Murakami's writing is what they call East meets West. What they mean by that is Murakami is really good at blending Western writing style with Japanese sensibilities. And though his characters are Japanese, just like Western people, they are more open with their feelings. Because, Japanese are very known to be reserved, they're not very open with their emotions. However, Murakami's characters are different in that aspect. Another important aspect of Murakami's writing is what they call the perfect blend between the highbrow and the lowbrow. And I'm going to explain that. Murakami is good at blending literary prestige with pop culture. Highbrow is more, traditional literature. It refers to art with intellectual depth. It's very academic, it's very deep, philosophical. Murakami's stories are in a way very philosophical. There's complex symbolism, there are heavy themes like death, there's alienation, identity, existential crisis. These are very heavy topics that we find in, highbrow art. And what we mean by lowbrow, it's like pop culture, it's mass culture. It's very accessible content, commercial content. In his novels, Murakami makes a lot of references, musical references, from jazz, pop music. There is, simple language, conversational prose, sex, humor, odd jobs, very casual dialogue. So this perfect blend between highbrow and lowbrow is one of the reasons why his books are very appealing and very enjoyable to read. For example, the Russian author Dostoevsky is also known to blend highbrow and lowbrow. He's known to tap into very deep psychological themes, but through the crime genre, for example. Now, when it comes to Murakami's way of writing, his manner of writing, he says he does not do research before he starts writing his novels because he believes that imagination is his asset. He wants his imagination to flow very freely. His characters, the world that he creates, everything flows very fluidly. And there's also something very special about Murakami's writing. It's literally one of my favorite things, is Murakami's attention to detail. He makes you focus on the smallest things. I'm going to give you an example. In a book, you will find a scene where a character is simply cooking a bowl of spaghetti. And you feel like this moment is very memorable, it's very enjoyable, it's very cozy. If you're a type of person who enjoys details, who enjoys observing the smallest things, you would enjoy reading Murakami books. For example, I know from myself, I love observing those very random, simple moments in life. I love watching someone do something, cooking something. I love when in a book they describe to you what a person is choosing at the supermarket and why they're choosing it. I love descriptions of people eating their meals, the way they take care of themselves, the way they groom themselves. Even if I'm watching a very dull movie where nothing is happening, even if a story seems very dull, sometimes those small details, they seem very mesmerizing and they stick with you. So Murakami is never about the bigger picture. He always zooms in on the smallest things. In Murakami stories, you will also find a lot of randomness. For example, characters in his stories, they don't make decisions out of, rational thinking. Sometimes they just make very spontaneous decisions. For example, in a story, you have a woman who wakes up one day and she decides to divorce her husband just because she had a dream about it. Something in a dream happened that pushed her to wake up in the morning and make that decision without any explanation. And it's not something that we're very used to. For example, in Western cultures, there's this obsession with why and how. You have to get to the bottom of something. And this is why I told you that Murakami stories can be very frustrating for people who like to know the reason behind everything. Because Murakami doesn't really believe in that. For him, it's not about the solution or the resolution. It's not about being pragmatic, being logical, being reasonable. He believes that the human psyche is very complex. In Murakami stories, you also find what I believe to be one of my favorite Japanese philosophies, and it's what is known as wabi-sabi. It's a Japanese aesthetic philosophy that finds beauty in simplicity, beauty in imperfection and impermanence. Everything changes, everything ages, nothing stays as it is. And instead of celebrating, perfection or luxury or extravagance, wabi-sabi values things that are incomplete, weathered, modest, transient or, ephemeral. And throughout his novels, or the ones that I've read so far, you feel like all his protagonists, they have traits in common. For example, his characters, they feel very familiar, and yet they feel very inaccessible. They're very solitary, they're very calm, very quiet. Some may seem passive, they're very emotionally muted. They're self-contained. There's no, big dramatic scene. Whatever happens, they deal with it in a very calm and collected way. They're very observant. They may feel emotionally detached. However, they're very sensitive. They feel things very deeply. Rather than favoring, very emotional and loud outbursts, Murakami favors more low volume emotional scenes. There's this feeling of nostalgia, or, his stories feel melancholic. It's like there's a quiet sadness to them. Loneliness, actually, it permeates Murakami's stories. But it doesn't feel like something desperate that the character is desperate to get out of. It feels like it's very accepted. His characters are very, solitary. He describes them as very normal people. They cook simple meals. They enjoy the simple things in life, music, books. They wander the cities. They have no real goal, no real aim. Murakami says that on the surface, they may seem, bland, but Murakami explains that it's because of this ordinariness that once the strangeness emerges, it seems even more interesting. Besides being lonely, his characters are also usually isolated. They have very few close relationships. They usually struggle with romantic relationships, and most of them are also estranged from their families. In the stories, Murakami's protagonists are also always the researchers, but for something that has nothing to do with their own goals. They have no goals, they have no aspirations. It's just that they're pulled into these strange quests out of nowhere. They follow these cryptic instructions and they're drawn to mysterious objects or places. Murakami likes to think of his characters as Hitchcockian characters. If you're familiar with Alfred Hitchcock's movies, his characters usually get themselves into these very strange situations, and these situations, they drag them further into trouble. So in Murakami's books, characters, they rarely begin by this very strong desire to change their lives. It's just that changes or unpredictable things happen to them, and they just go with it. They go with the flow, they deal with them. Now I'm gonna tell you about another interesting notion that taps into Japanese culture. I'm gonna explain to you how Murakami's characters are different from characters in other Japanese authors' books. In Japanese culture, you have these two aspects of a personality that they refer to as hone and tatemae. Those are two very important Japanese cultural concepts that refer to the inner true self versus the outward behavior. So in Japanese culture, you could say that there are two selves. Hone is your inner true self, the one that you know and the one that you share with no one or the closest people in your life. It is honest and private, and it's usually kept inside. Tatemae is what you express socially. It's what you decide to show to the world. You could say it's the socially appropriate behavior. It's polite, harmonizing, it's comforting to expectations. Japanese writers, they usually capture that very well in their writing. And you have to read between the lines to really understand the characters, to really understand their intentions, their feelings. However, Murakami's characters, they tell you everything. They're very transparent. They're very honest with their feelings. So you don't have this inner personality versus a contrasting social one or a contrasting persona that you put out there. They are as they are all the time. And this is why they they refer to Murakami's characters as felines sometimes. They like to describe them as cats in a way. And because Murakami has always had cats as pets, perhaps he gets inspired by his pets to write his characters. And he really does love them a lot. He describes them as free spirits. And you will also find a reference to cats in his books a lot, by the way. There's always a cat in his stories. Cats are traditionally associated with mystery, independence, and heightened senses. And in folklore across cultures, they're seen as creatures that move between the physical and the spiritual world. Murakami sees them as threshold creatures who are able to understand or see the hidden layers of reality. So yeah, you see cats a lot in his novels, and you see them interacting with the protagonists a lot. Now, when it comes to Murakami's writing, some people say that it's very reminiscent of Carl Jung's philosophy. But when asked about that, Murakami says that he doesn't consider himself as a Jungian scholar. However, people find a lot of similarities between the two. For example, in Murakami's novels, the subconscious, it takes on a physical shape. For example, the mysterious forest, the library that turns into a labyrinth. This all reflects the subconscious of the character. There are also a lot of references to the shadow self. For Carl Jung, shadow refers to anything that's repressed in ourselves, the dark parts of our personalities. Murakami externalizes these shadow figures as characters. For example, Kafka and his inner voice, or the sheep character in, the Strange Library story, and other strange characters that are here to represent something repressed or something that we have not figured out within our own psyche. In Kafka on the Shore, there's the character Oshima, who talks about the shadow self. Oshima explains that we all have a dark shadow within ourselves, and this shadow is made out of all the parts that we fear or that we reject. And by ignoring this shadow, we make it stronger. However, facing this shadow will stop it from controlling you. It's a very interesting analogy. There's another shadow-related moment. Kafka, at some point, he reflects internally that deep within him, he feels that exists a very violent, dark presence. He also senses that it is capable of murder. This, in a way, symbolizes the side of himself that he fears, which is the side that resembles his father, the side that he might have taken from his father, the side that he wants to try and avoid. So all of these images, they align with Carl Jung's idea of the shadow self as something separate from us. Another similarity that they found was treating dreams as if they were reality. Jung says that dreams are direct messages from our subconscious. And Murakami also treats a dream as something very important, something very meaningful that carries truths. And sometimes as characters, they rely on or they trust dreams more than reality itself. Now, I'm going to talk about a very sensitive topic because unfortunately it's always the elephant in the room when it comes to talking about Murakami Haruki, so I will not be able to, ignore it. I'm not going to talk about it in detail because, again, it's a very big topic, but I just thought I would mention it. Whenever I would start talking about Murakami's books, the first reaction that I would get is, oh yeah, I like his books, but I hate the way he talks about women. I've had this reaction every time I talked about Murakami with my students or my friends. So he's usually criticized for having misogynistic tendencies. They say that his female characters, they often appear as very one-dimensional, passive, and they only exist to serve the sexual needs of the male protagonists or to serve the emotional growth of the male characters. They are also seen as very enigmatic, very sexually confident, unpredictable. They take off, they vanish at some point. And they say that he often reduces his female characters to physical descriptions, focusing on the breasts, on the body shape, on the facial features. So they basically exist in the stories to cater to the male protagonist character's needs. Readers feel that his stories have very male-centric perspectives, that the stories are deeply rooted in the perspective of a middle-aged man, lonely man, where women are often the unstable characters, they're enigmas, and they are the source of the problem. Now, while he's not described universally or officially as a misogynistic writer, his work is known for having a very strong male gaze, and it's a gaze that objectifies women in a way. Now, reading the first novel, I didn't have the same intense reaction as my friends did or other readers did for two reasons. One reason is I might be a very messed up person. A second reason is because Murakami's writing stems from the culture he was brought up in. And if you want to talk about this issue, you need to understand the bigger picture, which is female representation in Japan and the culture altogether. And because I was kind of familiar with that, because I lived in the culture for years, there are things that I have come to understand. So this is why I didn't have the same shocked reaction as some of my friends, because something about it felt familiar to me. Because to be honest, I was more, reading my first Murakami novel, I was more preoccupied by this very strange genre that I was reading for the first time. I was experiencing magical realism for the first time. I was so confused. I was so mesmerized by what was happening. I was questioning every page. I was wondering if what I'm reading is actually happening or if it's just happening inside the character's mind. I was so hyper focused on everything that was happening at once. I was also attracted by the characters in a way because they're very unhinged. Again, the loneliness aspect and the alienation aspect was very appealing to me. So I'm gonna leave it at that because, again, it's a very, very big topic. Now, finally, I just want to talk about Murakami's work ethic, the way he writes, because I think it's very special and intense, not as simple as you may think. He has a very strict routine. There's physical endurance involved. There is solitary focus, and it's for a very long term. It's also described as monastic. Monastic is a word that's derived from monks, which is very similar to a monk's lifestyle. At some point in his life, Murakami decided to stop smoking. He decided to start going to bed very early, like 8 or 9, and he wakes up every day at 4. He writes for 5 to 6 hours every day. And one of the most important things that he started doing was running. He started running every day for at least an hour. Now, he has a list of advice for aspiring writers. He says it is very important to read a ton of novels. No training is more crucial. To write a novel, you must first understand it on a physical level, how one is put together. You have to plow through as many novels as you can while you're still young. Everything you can get your hands on. Great novels and crappy ones. I love artists who have this mindset. For example, Murakami encourages readers to read even bad books. And I also know that there's a famous film director, Guillermo del Toro. He always says that it's very important to him to watch a lot of movies, a ton of movies, even crappy stuff. And I do that in my classes as well. Let's say we're designing a poster. I ask my students to bring a collection of posters that are very well designed, and I also tell them to bring a series of very badly designed posters, because it's important to recognize the difference between the two. You learn more this way. So Murakami says that it doesn't matter what you read as long as you keep reading. Absorb as many stories as you physically can. This is the most important task. Writing is important too, but it can come later. There's no need to rush. My first step in my novel writing process is metaphorically cleaning off my desk. I will work on nothing but the novel until it's complete. If I happen to be writing a series of essays, for example, I have to break it off, at least for the time being, unless something really extraordinary comes along. All new projects are turned down. I'm the kind of person, when I throw myself into one thing, I can't do anything else. By the way, this is very relatable to me. I'm the same. Murakami says that it's okay to work on translations in parallel to the novel that he's writing, because translation has nothing to do with creative work. It's very technical. He says that it doesn't really hinder the work process, the creative process. Therefore, working simultaneously on a translation can actually aid in the process by helping me keep my mental balance. He compares it to stretching before exercising. When writing a novel, my rule is to produce roughly 10 Japanese manuscript pages, equivalent of 1,600 English words every day. This works out about 2.5 pages on my computer. On days where I want to write more, I stop after 10 pages. When I don't feel like writing, I force myself to somehow fulfill my quota. Now, there's an interesting notion. He says, why do I do it this way? Because it is especially important to maintain a steady pace when taking on a big project. That can't work if you write a lot one day and nothing at all the next day. So I punch in, I write my 10 pages, and then punch out, as if I am working on a time card. This sounds more like working in a factory, and I concur. That's not how artists work. But why must a novelist be an artist? Who made that rule? No one, right? So why not write in whatever way is more natural to you? Moreover, refusing to think of oneself as an artist removes a lot of pressure. More than being artists, novelists should think of themselves as free. Free meaning that we're able to do whatever we like, whenever we like, in any way we like, without worrying about how the world sees us. This is far better than wearing the stiff and formal robes of an artist. Writing novels is more stamina than talent. I awake early each morning, brew a fresh pot of coffee, and work for 5 to 6 hours straight. 10 pages a day means 300 pages a month. That works out to 1,800 pages in 6 months. No matter how long the novel is or complex its structure, I will have composed it without any fixed outline, not knowing how it will unfold or end, letting things take their course and improvising as I go, just like jazz, because Murakami is very inspired by jazz music, and jazz is a lot about improvisation. And even as he's working, he always plays music. So it inspires him. So he writes from intuition, not careful planning, similar to jazz. Also, jazz is about feeling more than explanation. Murakami emphasizes emotional coherence rather than strict realism. The rewrite usually takes a month or two. When I finish, I break for another week or so and then begin the second rewrite. Once I have finished, I take another break, and then plunge into the third rewrite. Writing a novel means sitting alone in my study for another year, sometimes 2, or even 3 years. Thinking that hard and long about something, your brain gets overheated. So after that, I need to give my head a rest. That's why I spend my afternoons napping, enjoying music, and reading books. Day after day, without exception, I repeat this cycle. The slogan of Alcoholics Anonymous is one day at a time. And that's exactly what life is like. Maintaining a rhythm, silently continue to do this, and at a certain point, something happens inside you. But it takes time to reach this point. And until then, you have to be very patient. Now, what do you need in order to patiently keep going? Needless to say, it's stamina. Whether you write novels or short stories or maintain creativity over a long period of time, you need kind of staying power that makes this continual process possible. Well then, what do you need to do to acquire that kind of stamina? I have one answer and a very simple one. You have to become physically fit. You need to become robust and physically strong and make your body your ally. Murakami says, I began running once I became a full-time writer, and for 30 years running for 1 hour a day, and sometimes swimming has been a regular part of my daily schedule. And I have continued to run every day without hardly ever taking a break. Once a year, I run a full marathon, and I've participated in triathlons as well. I enjoy running, and I am just continuing something that suits my personality. No matter how strong your will might be, you are not going to do something for 30 years if it doesn't suit you. Like I said before, Murakami writes while listening to music. Music, especially jazz, holds a very important place in his heart. He says he has learned so many things from music about writing. In a New Yorker interview in 2018, he said that I think there are 3 important elements that he learned from music, and those elements are important both for jazz and for writing to him: rhythm, harmony, and free improvisation. I learned those things from music, not from literature. And when I started to write, I write as though I were playing music. Now, when it comes to Murakami's work ethic and writing style, I also recently discovered something that I thought was very amazing and intense and a bit crazy. Apparently, Murakami, when he started writing, he didn't like his prose. So he had this idea of translating his manuscript into English and then translate the English version to Japanese again. And they say that this created the Murakami style. I thought it was very interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you that this is my next read, Murakami's 1Q84. Now I'm going to explain to you the title, why it's 1Q84. In Japanese, the number 9 is pronounced as Q. So this is supposed to be 1984. And apparently the title is based on George Orwell's novel, which is also entitled 1984. I love the Q twist. I thought it was very unique. By the way, every person in my life who has read this book has had almost the same reaction. No one was comfortable reading this book for some reason. I still have to figure out what is wrong with this book. I've had a lot of similar reactions of people saying I couldn't finish it, I had to stop it, it was very disturbing, it made me feel uneasy. I don't know what it's about. All I know, and all I'm going to tell you, is that this book has 2 volumes. There's still one that I have to get. So 1Q84 is a large immersive novel that blends magical realism, psychological depth, and quiet suspense in a version of Tokyo that feels almost familiar, yet subtly wrong. The story follows 2 main characters whose lives unfold in parallel. Aomame, a woman who notices that the world around her has begun to feel slightly altered, and Tango, a quiet, introspective writer who becomes involved in a mysterious literary project. As the novel progresses, their separate narratives gradually begin to echo and reflect each other, creating a sense that unseen connections are at work. Notice he likes to write about parallel stories that kind of connects. It happens in After Dark, it happens in Kafka on the Shore, and apparently it happens in this book. I'm very excited. It's going to be a long read, but I can't wait to see what I feel for it. And that's it for today about Murakami, a writer who's very beloved by a lot of readers around the world. His work has been translated to more than 50 languages. His books have sold millions of copies around the world. Murakami is an enigma. He keeps to himself. He rarely appears in public. He rarely gives interviews. I believe he's the king of magical realism, a genre that he has introduced me to, actually. He really does occupy a very special place in the world of literature. His stories are obscure, they're bizarre, they're very surreal, but somehow they also feel very comforting. It's so odd. So if you're interested in reading about talking cats or musical instruments made from cat spirits, or if you want to read about characters cooking spaghetti, if you want to read mentions about classical music or jazz or Prince or Led Zeppelin, if you are into topics like existential terror, cults, love, loss, isolation, alienation, melancholy, nostalgia, I think you would enjoy Murakami, and you will get used to this non-traditional way of telling a story, this linear framework that we're used to, what they call the Aristotle framework. By the way, Aristotle did not invent this framework, but he was the first one to describe and formalize it, which is the beginning, middle, and end framework. Murakami doesn't really use that. He doesn't really care about, having a clear beginning, a clear middle, a clear ending, and the ending that you would expect. Now, if you have any knowledge in Japanese fairy tales, for example, stories that are meant for kids, then you know that this is not the way their stories work. You don't have a moral at the end. You don't have the storyline where the good guys get rewarded, the bad guys get punished. It doesn't work this way. Japanese fairy tales, sometimes they end very tragically, actually. You reach the ending and you're shocked. Japanese fairy tales are very different from, let's say, the Western Grimm Brothers fairy tales. It's not really about the message. It's not really about the moral. They don't really care about that. They care more about the beauty of the story. They even see the beauty in the sadness. They see the beauty in the tragic. It's the same with Murakami. It's a very different way of telling a story. As cliche as that may sound, but Murakami doesn't really care about the ending. He cares more about the journey towards it. He cares about the journey of the characters, their inner journey. And And Murakami also wants the readers to feel free and liberated as his characters. He says that for 1,000 years, we have believed in fixed religions and social structures. In the stories, we feel dislodged, no longer anchored down, alienated from social conventions. Murakami invites us to be free. He touches a chord with our own search for something we're missing, a meaning, a person, a purpose. If you ever get into reading his books, I hope you enjoy the simplicity in his writing. I hope you enjoy the calmness and the slightly, detached, outer worldly vibe that he gives. It's very rhythmic. He makes you appreciate the smallest details from, everyday mundane stuff. It's very obvious how much Murakami enjoys writing. He does it in a very organic way. It's very honest. It's very unshowy, very humble. He says that when it comes to writing, everything went okay with him. However, it is in life that he did a lot of mistakes, which I thought was a very touching statement. Now, my last words, because I promised that I would read a favorite quote in every episode. I chose to read to you a passage that got stuck in my head the most from Kafka on the Shore. And it goes like this. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure, in fact, whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain. When you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is all about. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see you next time.